In 1971, Gene Wilder stepped through those chocolate factory doors and into our hearts forever. But somewhere between the purple velvet jacket and his final bow, Hollywood's most beloved eccentric simply disappeared. The man who made us believe, in pure imagination, who taught us that a little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men, quietly slipped away from the very world that had made him a legend. Tonight, we uncover the heartbreaking truth behind why Gene Wilder chose to vanish from the spotlight forever. A story more complex and moving than any role he ever played. Gene Wilder never wanted to be famous. Born Jerome Silberman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1933, he was an anxious child who found solace in the darkness of movie theaters, watching comedians like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton transform pain into laughter. But little did the world know, this future icon was already carrying the weight of tragedy that would define his entire approach to stardom. His father, William, suffered from a heart condition that doctors warned could be triggered by stress or excitement. Young Jerome learned to tiptoe through life, suppressing his natural exuberance, afraid that his own joy might literally kill the man he loved most. This early lesson that happiness could be dangerous, that laughter might come at a deadly cost, would haunt Wilder throughout his career, creating an internal conflict between his gift for bringing joy to others and his deep-seated fear of its consequences. When Wilder finally made it to Broadway and then to Hollywood, he approached fame like a man walking on thin ice. Unlike his contemporaries who reveled in the spotlight, Wilder remained perpetually uncomfortable with attention. He would later confess that every red carpet felt like a performance he wasn't sure he wanted to give. Every interview, a reminder that the shy boy from Milwaukee was wearing a mask he couldn't quite remove. This reluctance wasn't mere shy, was a prophetic understanding that fame, for someone with his sensitive soul, might exact a price too high to bear. As his star began to rise with roles in Bonnie and Clyde and The Producers, Wilder was already planning his eventual escape, though he didn't know it yet. The seeds of his future retreat were planted in those early moments when success felt more like a burden than a blessing. The entertainment industry, with its relentless demands and constant scrutiny, was perhaps the worst possible environment for a man who had spent his childhood learning to make himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable, yet it was also the only place where his extraordinary talent could fully bloom. Cruel irony that would eventually tear him apart. The year was 1967, and a chance encounter between Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks would reshape the landscape of American comedy forever. But what the public never knew was that this legendary partnership was born from Wilder's desperate need for creative control, a need that stemmed from his growing disillusionment with Hollywood's machine-like approach to entertainment. Brooks saw something in Wilder that even Wilder didn't see in himself, a perfect vessel for his anarchic vision. When Brooks cast him as the neurotic accountant, Leo Bloom in The Producers, he unleashed something primal in Wilder, a performance so raw and honest that it earned him an Oscar nomination and established him as one of comedy's most compelling voices. The partnership that followed through Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein was more than professional collaboration. It was a meeting of two wounded souls who found healing in making others laugh. Brooks, the loud, brash extrovert, provided the armor that Wilder needed to face the world, while Wilder brought the emotional depth that elevated Brooks' wild ideas into cinematic poetry. During the filming of Young Frankenstein, Wilder insisted on creative control that was unprecedented for an actor. He co-wrote the screenplay, demanded specific casting choices, and fought for the black and white cinematography that would make the film timeless. This wasn't ego, it was survival. Wilder had realized that the only way he could exist in Hollywood was to create his own protected space within it. But even as their collaborations brought him acclaim and financial success, Wilder was already beginning to feel the weight of expectation. Fans wanted him to be the manic, unpredictable character from the screen. But that persona required an emotional energy that was slowly draining him. The very success of his partnership with Brooks was creating a prison of public expectation from which he would eventually need to escape. The truth that would only emerge years later was that Wilder saw his work with Brooks as borrowed time, a brief, shining moment when his sensitivity and talent aligned with the right collaborator. He knew, even then, that such magic couldn't last forever, and he was already mourning its eventual end. When Gene Wilder stepped into that purple velvet jacket as Willy Wonka in 1971, he unknowingly sealed his fate. The role would become his masterpiece and his curse, a performance so iconic that it would overshadow everything else he ever did, and eventually contribute to his retreat from public life. Wilder brought unprecedented depth to what could have been a simple children's character, as Wonka was mysterious, slightly dangerous, and deeply human, a chocolate-making genius, whose whimsy masked profound loneliness. In many ways, Wilder was drawing from his own experience of being misunderstood, of having depths that the world wasn't interested in exploring beyond their surface appeal. The filming was grueling, not because of the physical demands, but because of the emotional weight Wilder brought to every scene. He insisted on making Wonka's first appearance, limping with a cane before executing a perfect forward roll symbolic of his own philosophy. that life's greatest joys often emerge from its darkest moments. This wasn't just acting, it was autobiography, disguised as fantasy. But the film's success created an impossible standard. Suddenly, everyone expected Gene Wilder to be Willy Wonka, eccentric, unpredictable, always on premieres and public appearances. Children would look at him with the same wonder they reserved for the character, not understanding that the man behind Wonka was far more fragile than his creation. The psychological toll was immense. Wilder began to feel like he was living inside a chocolate factory of the public's making, where he was expected to perform magic on demand. The spontaneity that had made his performance so brilliant became a prison of expectation. He started declining interviews, avoiding public appearances, and retreating into the writing and directing work that allowed him more control over his public persona. Years later, Wilder would reveal that he sometimes looked at old clips of himself as Wonka and felt like he was watching a stranger, someone who had somehow channeled a kind of fearless creativity that he could no longer access. The role had taken something from him that he could never get back, even as it gave him immortality in the hearts of millions. In 1982, Gene Wilder met Gilda Radner on the set of Hanky Panky, and what began as a professional collaboration quickly blossomed into one of Hollywood's most genuine love stories. But what the public didn't know was that this relationship would become both Wilder's salvation and the catalyst for his eventual withdrawal from the entertainment industry. Gilda Radner was everything Wilder wasn't: bold, unafraid, willing to make herself vulnerable for the sake of a laugh. Her fearlessness on Saturday Night Live had made her America's sweetheart. But privately, she battled demons that mirrored Wilder's own. They found in each other a rare understanding, two comedic souls who knew that the funniest people often carry the deepest pain. Their marriage in 1984 was a brief, shining moment of happiness for Wilder. For the first time since his childhood, he felt truly understood. Gilda didn't need him to be on all the time. She loved the quiet, thoughtful man behind the manic performances. Together, they created a private world where they could be themselves, without the pressure of public expectation. But their happiness was short. In 1986, Gilda was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, beginning a 3-year battle that would test every fiber of Wilder's being. The man who had made millions laugh found himself helpless in the face of a tragedy that no amount of humor could soften. He watched the woman he loved, vibrant, funny, irreplaceable Gilda, slowly slip away, despite the best medical care money could buy. During Gilda's illness, Wilder made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stepped away from his career to care for her. The man who had once been one of Hollywood's most sought-after talents simply disappeared from the industry, dedicating himself entirely to his wife's comfort and care. When Gilda died in 1989, something fundamental broke inside Gene Wilder. The loss wasn't just personal, it was professional. The joy that had fueled his performances, the lightness that had made his characters so beloved, had been buried with the woman who had understood him best. He would never truly recover from this loss, and it would ultimately drive his decision to leave Hollywood forever. After Gilda's death, well-meaning friends and industry colleagues encouraged Gene Wilder to return to work, believing that performing would help him heal. What they didn't understand was that for Wilder, acting had always been an act of joy, and joy was now a luxury he could no longer afford. His first project after Gilda's death was Funny About Love in 1990, a romantic comedy that should have been a safe return to familiar territory. But on set, something was clearly wrong. The effortless spontaneity that had characterized his earlier performances was gone, replaced by a mechanical precision that felt hollow. Co-stars and crew members noticed that Wilder seemed to be performing his old self rather than actually being himself. The film was a critical and commercial failure. But more devastating than the poor reviews was Wilder's realization that he could no longer access the part of himself that had made him great. The connection between his personal joy and his professional talent had been severed, and no amount of technique or professionalism could bridge that gap. Industry insiders began to whisper that Gene Wilder was difficult or unreliable, not understanding that he was a man in mourning trying to pretend that the most essential part of himself hadn't died along with his wife. The pressure to return to his old form only deepened his sense of alienation from the industry he had once called home. During this period, Wilder began to seriously consider retirement. He started declining roles that would have been automatic acceptances in earlier years, and when he did work, he chose projects that felt meaningful rather than commercially viable. This shift in priorities was seen by some as career suicide, but for Wilder, it was a matter of survival. The truth that would only become clear years later was that Wilder's failed comeback wasn't a failure at all. It was a conscious decision to preserve what remained of his artistic integrity rather than trading on the ghost of his former self. Few people know that in the early 1990s, Gene Wilder had been secretly developing what he considered his masterpiece, a dark, psychologically complex adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that would have combined his love of fantasy with his newfound understanding of loss and grief. This project, which never came to fruition, represents one of the greatest what-ifs in cinema history and marked the beginning of his final disillusionment with Hollywood. Wilder's vision for Alice was revolutionary, not the whimsical children's story that had been adapted countless times, but a mature exploration of madness, identity, and the thin line between fantasy and reality. Having lived through Gilda's illness and death, he understood better than most how the mind creates elaborate defenses against unbearable truth. His Alice would have been a woman using Wonderland as an escape from a reality too painful to bear. He spent 2 years developing the script, pouring his grief and wisdom into every page. This was to be his directorial comeback, the project that would establish him as a serious filmmaker rather than just a comedic actor. He assembled an impressive creative team and even secured preliminary interest from several major studios. But Hollywood had changed during his absence. The industry that had once embraced his quirky sensibilities now demanded market research, focus groups, and demographic targeting. Studio executives couldn't understand why America's favorite funny man wanted to make a dark, introspective art film. They wanted the old Gene Wilder, the one who could guarantee laughs and box office returns. The rejection of his Alice project was the final straw. Wilder realized that the industry he had once called home no longer had a place for the artist. He had become the boy who had learned to suppress his joy to protect his father's heart, now found himself in an industry that would only accept him if he suppressed his growth and wisdom to protect their bottom line. When the project was officially shelved in 1993, Wilder quietly began making plans for his exit from Hollywood. The Alice script, which he never allowed to be produced by anyone else, remains locked away, a testament to the artistic vision that the world was too afraid to embrace. In 1994, Gene Wilder made a decision that shocked Hollywood. He accepted a position teaching acting at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop for an industry that measures success solely in terms of visibility and earnings. This move was incomprehensible. But for Wilder, it was the beginning of his real life's work. The transition from movie star to college professor wasn't easy. Students, who had grown up watching Willy Wonka, struggled to see past the icon to the man who had decades of hard-won wisdom to share. Wilder had to learn to be authoritative without being authoritarian, to command respect through knowledge rather than celebrity. But gradually, something beautiful emerged. In the classroom, Wilder rediscovered the joy of creation without the pressure of commercial success. He could explore the craft of acting, the psychology of character, and the alchemy of comedy with young people who were hungry to learn. For the first time in years, he felt useful in a way that didn't require him to sacrifice his authenticity. His teaching style was unique, drawing from method acting techniques, but also from his own experiences with loss, love, and the complicated relationship between performer and audience. Students later recalled classes where Wilder would spend hours discussing not just how to deliver a line, but why that line mattered, what it revealed about the human condition. During this period, Wilder also began writing seriously, not screenplays intended for production, but novels that explored the inner lives of characters facing extraordinary circumstances. His first novel, My French Whore, was a departure from comedy, a tender story of love and memory that revealed depths his film work had only hinted at. The university years were healing for Wilder in ways that Hollywood never could be. He was valued for his mind rather than his ability to perform on command, respected for his insights rather than his capacity to generate laughter. It was a quiet success, invisible to the entertainment media that had once documented his every move, but infinitely more satisfying than anything fame had offered. In 2005, Gene Wilder published Kiss Me Like a Stranger, My Search for Love and Art, a memoir that finally gave the world insight into the man behind the characters they had loved for decades. But even this deeply personal book revealed how completely he had removed himself from the Hollywood ecosystem that had once defined his existence. The memoir was Wilder's attempt to set the record straight, not just about his career, but about his life, his relationships, and his decisions. He wrote about his struggles with anxiety, his complicated relationship with fame, and the profound impact of Gilda's death on his worldview. For the first time, the public understood that his retreat from Hollywood hadn't been a career misstep, but a conscious choice to preserve his sanity and integrity. Most significantly, the book revealed the extent to which Wilder had been misunderstood throughout his career. The manic energy that audiences associated with his performances wasn't his natural state. It was a carefully crafted persona designed to meet other people's expectations. The real Gene Wilder was thoughtful, melancholy, and deeply intellectual, qualities that had been largely invisible to a public that preferred their comedians simple and The memoir's publication coincided with a brief period where it seemed Wilder might return to public life. He did a limited number of interviews, appeared at a few film festivals, and even hinted at the possibility of new projects. But those who watched closely could see that these appearances exhausted him. The man who had once energized audiences with his presence now seemed drained by the very act of being seen. Critics and fans praised the book for its honesty and insight, but many missed its deeper message. This was Wilder's farewell letter to the entertainment industry. He was explaining his absence not as a prelude to return, but as justification for his permanent departure. The memoir was his way of saying goodbye on his own terms, offering one final gift to the people who had loved his work while making it. Clear that the gift was complete. In the years that followed, Wilder would retreat even further from public view, making the memoir feel like a final communication from a man who had decided that his private life was more valuable than any public legacy. What the public didn't know, what Gene Wilder kept hidden with the same determination he had once brought to his performances, was that by the mid-2000s, he was already beginning to show signs of the Alzheimer's disease that would ultimately claim his life. The diagnosis, which came quietly and was shared with only his closest family members, explained much about his increasing reclusiveness and his final retreat from public life. For a man whose career had been built on his sharp wit and improvisational genius, the early symptoms of cognitive decline were particularly cruel. Wilder began to experience moments of confusion, difficulty finding words, and lapses in memory that went beyond normal aging. The man who had once been able to craft complex, spontaneous performances found himself struggling to maintain simple conversations. The diagnosis was kept secret at Wilder's insistence. He had watched his beloved Gilda's private medical struggles become public spectacle, and he was determined to maintain his dignity as the disease progressed. His few close friends and family members became guardians of this secret, protecting him from the media attention that would have made his condition exponentially more difficult to bear. This hidden health battle explains many of the decisions that had puzzled fans and industry observers. His reluctance to appear in public, his refusal to take on new projects, and his increasing isolation weren't the choices of a difficult or antisocial celebrity. They were the careful strategies of a man trying to preserve whatever remained of his cognitive abilities while maintaining the privacy he had always treasured. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Wilder himself. The disease that was slowly stealing his memories was also protecting him from the pressure to relive his past for public consumption. As his ability to perform diminished, so did the industry's interest in his participation, creating a natural boundary that allowed him to fade from view without having to actively reject opportunities. His wife, Karen Boyer, became his primary caregiver and the architect of his privacy, ensuring that his final years would be spent in the quiet dignity he had always preferred over the chaos of celebrity. In his final coherent years, Gene Wilder embarked on what may have been his most important project, a series of handwritten letters to his younger self, to Gilda, and to the characters he had played throughout his career. These letters, discovered after his death and kept private at his family's request, represent his truest final performance, not for an audience, but for his own understanding of a life fully lived. The letters to his younger self were both tender and heartbreaking, filled with advice about the importance of protecting one's inner life, warnings about the seductive dangers of fame, and reassurances that the sensitivity he had always seen as a weakness was actually his greatest strength. In shaky handwriting that grew progressively more difficult to read, Wilder apologized to the anxious boy from Milwaukee for the burdens he had carried, and thanked him for the gifts he had given to the world. His letters to Gilda were love letters to a ghost's conversations with the woman who had understood him better than anyone else ever would. In them, he shared the details of his daily life, the books he was reading, the birds he watched outside his window, the memories that surfaced, unbidden and brought both joy and sorrow. These letters revealed a man at peace with his solitude, finding in his own company the understanding he had once sought from the world. Perhaps most poignantly, Wilder wrote letters to his most beloved characters, Willy Wonka, the Waco Kid, Dr. Frankenstein, thanking them for allowing him to explore parts of himself he couldn't access in ordinary life. He acknowledged that these characters had been more than roles. They had been vessels for his deepest emotions and most profound insights about the human condition. As his handwriting became increasingly illegible and his thoughts more fragmentary, the letters began to resemble abstract art loops and lines that suggested meaning without always achieving it. But even in their dissolution, they maintained a kind of poetry, a testament to a creative spirit that endured even as the mind that housed it began to fade. These final writings, which will likely never be made public, represent Gene Wilder's true farewell, not to his fans or his industry, but to himself, to his memories, and to the extraordinary life he had lived largely hidden from the world that thought it knew him. During his final decade, Gene Wilder became something the entertainment industry rarely produces: a philosopher. Freed from the demands of performance and public appearance, he spent his days reading voraciously, thinking deeply, and arriving at insights about life, art, and human nature that would have been impossible during his years in the spotlight. His personal library, which filled several rooms of his Connecticut home, became his university. He read everything: philosophy, poetry, science, history, approaching each book with the same intensity he had once brought to studying a script. Friends who visited during this period described a man who had found a different kind of performance, the daily practice of learning, thinking, and growing beyond the confines of his public persona. Wilder became particularly fascinated with the concept of authenticity, reading extensively about the masks we wear and the prices we pay for others' acceptance. His margins were filled with notes that revealed a man coming to terms with the cost of his earlier compromises. Understanding, finally, that his retreat from Hollywood hadn't been surrendered, but victorious successful escape from a system that would have consumed whatever remained of his true self. He also developed a deep appreciation for silence, something that had been virtually impossible during his performing years. The quiet of his home, broken only by the sounds of nature and the turning of pages, became a kind of meditation. He learned to find in solitude the peace that had eluded him in even his happiest moments on stage or screen. His philosophical evolution was aided by his correspondence with other artists who had made similar choices, writers, painters, and musicians who had stepped away from commercial success to pursue deeper truths. Through these letters, he became part of an invisible community of artists who had chosen authenticity over acclaim, wisdom over wealth. This period of intellectual growth gave Wilder something he had never experienced during his Hollywood years, a sense of completion he had found in his own company, the understanding and acceptance he had spent decades seeking from others. By 2010, Gene Wilder had achieved something remarkable in American celebrity culture. He had successfully made himself invisible. While his films continued to delight new generations of viewers, the man himself had become a ghost, present in the culture but absent from the machinery that had once defined his existence. This invisibility was a carefully orchestrated performance. In itself, unlike other stars who struggled to maintain privacy, Wilder had learned to disappear completely, moving through the world without recognition, living a quiet life that bore no resemblance to his former celebrity existence. When he was occasionally spotted by fans, they often reported that he seemed like a completely different person, quieter, more fragile, but somehow more real than the manic characters they remembered from the screen. His few remaining public appearances became increasingly rare and precious. A brief interview here, a small appearance there, each one feeling like a gift from someone who no longer owed the public anything. Those who encountered him during this period described a man who had achieved something almost impossible. In American culture, he had successfully let go of his public identity without bitterness or regret. The entertainment industry, meanwhile, had largely moved on. The kind of character-driven comedy that Wilder had mastered was increasingly rare in an era of franchise filmmaking and market-tested humor. His absence from the industry coincided with the absence of the values he had represented: originality, authenticity, and the belief that comedy could be both funny and profound. But his invisibility also revealed something beautiful about his legacy. Unlike celebrities whose relevance depends on constant public presence, Wilder's work had achieved a kind of immortality that existed independently of his physical presence. Children, discovering Willy Wonka for the first time, experienced the same wonder that had captivated audiences decades earlier, proving that true art transcends its creator's mortality. In becoming invisible, Gene Wilder had achieved the rarest form of celebrity. He had become beloved not for who he was, but for what he had given to the world. As Alzheimer's disease gradually claimed more of Gene Wilder's memory and cognitive abilities, his wife Karen Boyer became not just his caregiver, but the guardian of his dignity and the protector of his carefully constructed privacy. Their relationship, which had begun in the early 1990s and culminated in marriage in 1991, became a testament to a different kind of love story, one built not on shared fame, but on shared values and mutual respect. Karen, a clinical supervisor who worked with cancer patients, understood better than most the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of devastating illness. She had watched Wilder care for Gilda with the same devotion, and she brought to his care the professional expertise and personal commitment that allowed him to remain in his own home, surrounded by familiar comforts. As his condition progressed, the couple's decision to keep his diagnosis private was controversial to some, who felt that a public figure had a responsibility to share his struggle with a disease that affected millions. But Karen and Gene's few close friends understood that this privacy wasn't selfish, it was essential to his well-being. The man who had spent his career giving so much of himself to others deserved to keep his final years for himself. During his final period, when his ability to recognize even close family members became sporadic, Wilder would sometimes have moments of clarity where he seemed to remember exactly who he was and what he had accomplished. Karen learned to treasure these moments, not trying to force them or extend them, but simply being present for whatever version of her husband each day brought. She also became the curator of his legacy, carefully managing the use of his image and likeness, ensuring that his work continued to bring joy to new audiences while protecting him from exploitation. Her stewardship extended beyond legal and financial matters to the preservation of his reputation as an artist who had valued integrity above all else. In protecting Gene Wilder's privacy, Karen Boyer protected something larger: the right of artists to define the terms of their own relationship with fame and the possibility that even in an age of relentless publicity, it's still possible to live and die with dignity. On August 29, 2016, Gene Wilder died at his home in Stamford, Connecticut, surrounded by family and the quiet he had spent his final years cultivating. The cause was complications from Alzheimer's disease, though the public wouldn't learn of his long battle with the condition until after his death. Even in dying, Wilder managed to surprise a world that thought it knew his story. The announcement of his death, delayed by several hours to allow family members to be notified, sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and devastated millions of fans worldwide. But the manner of his death, peaceful, private, and dignified, seemed perfectly consistent with the choices he had made throughout his final decades. Karen Boyer's statement announcing his passing was brief and elegant, explaining their decision to keep his illness private. He simply couldn't bear the idea of one less smile in the world. The statement revealed not just the progression of his disease, but the philosophy that had guided his entire approach to his final years. Even in his confusion and decline, Wilder had remained concerned with the impact his condition might have on others. The tributes that followed revealed the true scope of his influence. Fellow actors, directors, and writers shared stories not just of his professional achievements, but of his kindness, his generosity, and his fundamental decency. Many revealed that he had quietly helped them during difficult periods, offering support and encouragement without seeking recognition or repayment. Perhaps most tellingly, the tributes came not just from his contemporaries, but from artists decades younger who had been inspired by his work without ever meeting him. His performances had created a kind of artistic DNA that had influenced generations of comedians and actors, proving that his retreat from Hollywood hadn't diminished his impact. It had simply made that impact more pure and lasting. The funeral was small and private, attended only by family and close friends. There was no public memorial service, no star-studded tribute, just the quiet goodbye that Wilder had always preferred to the grand gestures of celebrity culture. In the end, Gene Wilder's decision to vanish from the spotlight forever wasn't a retreat, it was a masterpiece. By stepping away from fame at the height of his powers, by choosing privacy over publicity and authenticity over acclaim, he gave his work something that most celebrity careers never achieve: timeless purity. Consider the alternative. What if Wilder had remained in Hollywood, accepting diminishing roles in increasingly commercial projects, trading on his past glory while his health declined? What if his struggle with Alzheimer's had become a public spectacle, documented by tabloids and exploited by those who profit from celebrity suffering? His legacy would have been tainted by the same machinery that had made him famous. His final years defined by decline rather than dignity. Instead, by disappearing, Wilder allowed his work to exist in perfect suspension. Every child who discovers Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory meets the character at his most vibrant and mysterious, unencumbered by knowledge of the actor's personal struggles or industry politics. Every adult who revisits Young Frankenstein encounters comedy at its purest, unmarked by the compromises and calculations that define most commercial entertainment. His disappearance also preserves something precious about the nature of artistic mystery. In an age where celebrities share every detail of their lives on social media, where privacy is seen as suspicious and publicity as mandatory, Wilder's choice to remain hidden reminded us that artists are not obligated to explain themselves or their work. Sometimes the greatest gift an artist can give is to step aside and let their creation speak for itself. The man who taught us that a little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men understood something profound about the relationship between creator and creation. By vanishing from the spotlight, he ensured that his characters would never be diminished by comparison to their creator's mortality, that his films would never be overshadowed by his personal struggles, and that his legacy would remain as pure and untainted as the day he first stepped through those chocolate factory doors. Gene Wilder's disappearance from Hollywood wasn't a tragedy, it was a triumph. The shy boy from Milwaukee, who had always been uncomfortable with attention, found, in his final decades, the peace that had eluded him during his years of fame. He taught us that sometimes the greatest act of creativity is knowing when to stop creating, that the most powerful performance can be the decision to leave the stage while the audience still wants more. His legacy isn't just the laughter he gave us or the characters he created, but the profound lesson he taught about the value of authenticity in a world that constantly demands performance. In a culture obsessed with visibility and relevance, Gene Wilder showed us that it's possible to matter deeply while remaining invisible, to influence millions while living quietly, to achieve immortality through the simple act of being genuinely, uncompromisingly yourself. Tonight, as we remember the man who made us believe in chocolate rivers and singing cowboys, let's honor his choice to prioritize his humanity over his celebrity. Gene Wilder didn't vanish from the spotlight. He escaped into the place where all the greatest artists ultimately live, in the hearts and minds of the people whose lives they touched. What do you think? Did Gene Wilder make the right choice in stepping away from fame? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the hidden lives of Hollywood's greatest stars. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories are the ones that happen when the cameras stop rolling.